The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the luxury penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Isabella wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished polishing the last of the crystal glasses in the dining room. At 28, she had been cleaning houses for wealthy families for 3 years now, and she thought she had seen it all. But this place was different. This place belonged to someone who seemed to have more money than sense. The penthouse took up the entire top floor of one of the city's most expensive buildings. Every room was filled with expensive furniture, artwork that probably cost more than most people made in a year, and gadgets that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. Isabella had been working here for 2 weeks now, and she still couldn't believe how one person could own so much stuff. Her phone buzzed with a text from her cleaning service supervisor. "How's the new client? Mr. Davidson treating you well?" Isabella smiled as she typed back, "He's barely home. Perfect for me." And it was true. In the 2 weeks she'd been cleaning his place, she'd only seen him a handful of times. He was always rushing out the door with his phone pressed to his ear, talking about deals and meetings and numbers that made her head spin. But what Isabella didn't know was that David Davidson had been watching her more closely than she realized. At 35, David had built his fortune by creating apps that millions of people used every day. His latest creation had just sold for more money than most small countries had in their entire budget. He was rich, successful, and completely miserable. The problem was that David's success had come with a price. The more money he made, the more people seemed to want something from him. His last girlfriend had left him just 2 months ago, telling him that he was cold and heartless, and that he treated people like they were objects instead of human beings. Her words had stung more than he wanted to admit, but instead of looking inward, David had decided that everyone else was the problem. That morning, David sat in his home office, pretending to work on his laptop while actually watching Isabella through the security cameras he had installed throughout the apartment. He told himself it was for security reasons, but the truth was that he was planning something that would make him feel powerful again. He was going to embarrass her, and he was going to do it in front of all his wealthy friends. Isabella had no idea she was being watched as she went about her work. She hummed quietly to herself as she dusted the expensive sculptures in the living room, being extra careful not to damage anything. She had learned long ago that working for rich people meant being invisible. Do your job well, don't ask questions, and definitely don't touch anything you don't have to. But David was looking for any excuse to find fault with her work. He zoomed in on the camera feed, watching as she carefully moved each item before cleaning under it and put it back in exactly the same position. He watched as she used different cleaning products for different surfaces, taking care not to damage the expensive materials. He watched as she even straightened his books and organized his mail without being asked. This wasn't going according to plan. David had expected to catch her being careless or lazy, but Isabella was proving to be frustratingly professional. She was thorough, careful, and efficient. She never took breaks longer than necessary, never used his phone or computer, and never even looked at his personal belongings for longer than it took to clean around them. Isabella finished the living room and moved to the kitchen, where she began the tedious process of cleaning the 6-burner stove that David never used. He ordered takeout almost every night, but the stove still needed to be cleaned to maintain its perfect appearance. As she worked, she thought about her own small apartment across town. It was tiny compared to this place, but it was hers, and she had worked hard to afford it. What David didn't know was that Isabella had dreams beyond cleaning houses. Every night after work, she would go home and spend hours on her laptop, working on something that meant more to her than any of the expensive things she cleaned every day. She was writing a book, and it was going to change everything. David's phone rang, interrupting his surveillance. It was his friend Richard, calling to confirm the dinner party David was hosting next week. "You still planning to have that big dinner next Friday?" Richard asked. "I've been looking forward to it." "Of course," David replied, a smile creeping across his face. "It's going to be very entertaining. I promise you won't be bored." As David talked to his friend, he began to formulate his plan more clearly. He would invite 8 of his wealthiest friends to dinner. They were all people like him, successful, rich, and used to getting their way. They would appreciate the show he was planning to put on. He would wait until Isabella was working during the dinner. Then he would find some way to embarrass her. In front of everyone. Maybe he would accuse her of breaking something, or claim she had been snooping through his things. The thought made David feel better about himself. He had been feeling powerless since his girlfriend left him, like he wasn't in control of anything in his life. But this would remind him that he had power over other people. He had money, influence, and the ability to make or break someone's day with just a few words. Isabella finished the kitchen and moved on to David's bedroom, where she began the careful process of making his bed with the expensive sheets that cost more than she made in a week. She had become an expert at hospital corners and could make a bed look like it belonged in a 5-star hotel. As she worked, she thought about the contrast between David's life and her own. Here was a man who had everything anyone could want: money, success, a beautiful home, and the freedom to do whatever he pleased. But in the 2 weeks she had been working for him, she had never seen him smile. Not once. He always looked stressed, angry, or just plain unhappy. It made her wonder what the point of having all that money was if it didn't make you happy. Meanwhile, Isabella lived in a small apartment and worked hard for every dollar she earned. But she woke up every morning excited about the day ahead. She had goals, dreams, and a purpose that went beyond just accumulating wealth. She was building something meaningful, something that would help other people understand the world better. As she finished making David's bed, Isabella noticed a framed photo on his nightstand. It showed David with a woman who looked like she belonged in a magazine. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect everything. But the photo had been turned face down, as if David couldn't bear to look at it. Isabella felt a moment of sympathy for her employer. Maybe having all that money wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. David was too busy planning his cruel entertainment to notice Isabella's compassion. He spent the rest of the day making calls to his friends, confirming the dinner party, and hinting that they were in for a special treat. He ordered expensive wine, hired a chef, and even bought new dishes for the occasion. Everything had to be perfect for his plan. Humiliation of the woman who cleaned his house. As Isabella packed up her cleaning supplies and prepared to leave for the day, she had no idea that her employer was planning to make her the centerpiece of his next dinner party. She was focused on getting home to work on her book, completely unaware that her quiet, professional life was about to be turned upside down by a man who had forgotten how to treat other people with basic human decency. The next morning, David woke up with a twisted sense of excitement. Today, he would start setting his trap. He had spent half the night thinking about different ways to catch Isabella making a mistake, and now he was ready to put his plan into action. He felt like a hunter preparing to catch his prey, completely ignoring the voice in his head that whispered this was wrong. David started small. He left his expensive watch on the bathroom counter, right where Isabella would have to clean. Around it. It was worth more than most people made in 6 months, and he positioned it so she would have to move it to do her job properly. He set up his phone to record, hoping to catch her being careless with it, or maybe even tempted to try it on. But when he checked the footage later, he was disappointed. Isabella had simply moved the watch to a safe spot, cleaned the counter thoroughly, and placed it back in exactly the same position. She had even wiped the watch itself gently with a soft cloth, making it shinier than it had been before. David gritted his teeth in frustration. This wasn't going according to plan. Isabella noticed that her employer had started leaving expensive items around the house, but she didn't think much of it. Rich people were often careless with their belongings because they could easily replace them. She had worked for a family once where the teenage daughter regularly left diamond earrings on the bathroom floor like they were worthless pieces of plastic dot the next day. David tried a different approach. He scattered important-looking papers across his desk, including what appeared to be confidential business documents and personal financial information. Surely, he thought, Isabella would be curious enough to take a peek. He had read somewhere that household staff often gossiped about their employers, and he was certain he could catch her snooping through his private affairs. Again, Isabella surprised him. She dusted around the papers without moving them, using a small brush to clean between the documents without disturbing their arrangement. She didn't even glance at the text on the pages. To her, they were just obstacles to work around, not sources of juicy gossip. Her focus remained entirely on doing her job well. David's frustration grew with each passing day. He began leaving cash in obvious places, expensive jewelry on countertops, and even his laptop open with banking information displayed on the screen. But Isabella treated each item with the same professional indifference. She cleaned around everything, never touched what she didn't need to touch, and certainly never showed any sign of temptation or curiosity. Meanwhile, Isabella was beginning to notice something strange about her employer's behavior. David had started hanging around the apartment more often when she was there, making excuses to walk through rooms she was cleaning. He would pretend to be looking for something or claim he needed to make an important phone call, but Isabella could feel his eyes watching her every move. At first, she wondered if he was worried about theft. Some wealthy clients became paranoid about their household staff, especially after hearing horror stories from their friends. But David's watching felt different somehow. It felt calculating, like he was waiting for something specific to happen. David decided to escalate his efforts. He began making increasingly unreasonable demands, hoping to push Isabella to her breaking point. He asked her to clean the chandelier in the dining room, which hung 15 feet above the table and required a special ladder that he claimed was broken. He wanted her to reorganize his entire library alphabetically, then change her mind halfway through and ask her to organize it by publication date instead. He gave her a list of tasks that would normally take 2 people an entire day, and expected her to finish everything in her usual 4-hour shift. He complained about imaginary dust on surfaces she had just cleaned and pointed out water spots on glasses that were already sparkling. Each demand was designed to make her fail, to give him ammunition for his planned public humiliation. But Isabella continued to surprise him at every turn. When he asked her to clean the chandelier, she politely explained that she couldn't safely reach it without proper equipment, but she offered to arrange for a professional chandelier cleaning service. No extra charge. When he wanted his library reorganized, she worked efficiently and systematically, completing the task faster than he thought possible. For the impossible daily task lists, Isabella simply prioritized the most important items and worked steadily through as much as she could accomplish safely. When David complained about her not finishing everything, she calmly explained which tasks she had completed and offered to return the next day to finish the remaining items at no additional cost. Got her professional responses and problem-solving abilities frustrated David beyond belief. He had expected her to get flustered, make excuses, or even quit. Instead, she remained calm, helpful, and solutions-oriented. She was making him look unreasonable, and he knew it. What David didn't realize was that Isabella had dealt with difficult clients before. She had worked for demanding perfectionists, paranoid millionaires, and even a few people who seemed to enjoy making their staff miserable. She had learned that the best approach was to stay professional, focus on doing excellent work, and never take their behavior personally. Isabella had also noticed something else during her weeks at David's apartment. Despite all his wealth and success, he seemed deeply unhappy. She had seen the prescription bottles for anxiety medication in his bathroom cabinet. She had noticed the empty alcohol bottles in his recycling bin. She had observed that he never seemed to have friends over, never got calls that made him laugh, and never appeared to enjoy any of the luxury surrounding him. This observation made Isabella feel sorry for David rather than angry about his increasingly unreasonable behavior. She recognized the signs of someone who is struggling emotionally, even if they were expressing it in unpleasant ways. Her natural compassion made her want to do an even better job, hoping that having a clean, organized home might bring him some small measure of peace. David's final test came when he decided to create an obviously impossible situation. He spilled red wine on his white carpet right before Isabella arrived, then claimed it had been there for days and demanded she remove the stain completely. He was certain this would be her breaking point. Isabella examined the stain carefully, then went to work with various cleaning solutions and techniques she had learned over the years. She worked patiently for over an hour, treating the carpet with different products and using specialized tools she carried in her cleaning kit. By the time she finished, the stain was completely gone, and the carpet looked better than it had when she started. David watched in amazement as Isabella transformed what he thought was a ruined carpet back to its original pristine condition. He realized that she wasn't just a cleaner. She was a skilled professional who took pride in her work and had developed real expertise over the years. As the day of his dinner party approached, David found himself in an unexpected position. Instead of having ammunition to embarrass Isabella, he had witnessed her handle every challenge with grace, skill, and professionalism. She had exceeded his expectations at every turn, solved every problem he created, and maintained her dignity throughout his increasingly unreasonable demands. But David's pride wouldn't let him admit that his plan had backfired. He was too invested in his scheme to back down now. His friends were expecting entertainment, and he had promised them something special. Despite Isabella's impressive performance, he was determined to find a way to embarrass her in front of his guests. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both their lives forever, though neither of them could have predicted how dramatically the evening would unfold. Friday evening arrived with the kind of excitement that comes before something important is about to happen. David had spent the entire day preparing for his dinner party, making sure every detail was perfect. The expensive caterer had delivered gourmet food, the wine cellar had been opened to reveal bottles worth thousands of dollars, and the dining room looked like something from a luxury magazine. 8 of David's wealthiest friends began arriving at 7 o'clock sharp. There was Robert, who owned a chain of high-end restaurants across the country. Catherine had inherited her father's real estate empire and now controlled half the commercial buildings downtown. Michael had made his fortune in the stock market and loved to brag about his latest investments. The others were equally successful, equally wealthy, and equally used to getting whatever they wanted in life. Isabella had no idea she was walking into a trap when she arrived for her regular Friday cleaning session. David had specifically asked her to come during the dinner party, claiming he needed someone to help with small tasks during the evening. He had offered to pay her double her usual rate, which Isabella couldn't afford to turn down. She thought she would just be helping with dishes and keeping the kitchen clean while the guests enjoyed their meal. As Isabella quietly worked in the kitchen, she could hear the laughter and conversation from the dining room. David's friends were clearly having a good time, sharing stories about their latest business deals and vacation destinations that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Isabella focused on her work, staying out of sight and making sure everything remained spotless. David spent the first hour of dinner being the perfect host, making sure his guests had everything they needed. But he kept glancing toward the kitchen, waiting for the right moment to put his plan into action. He had rehearsed what he would say, how he would embarrass Isabella in front of everyone, and how his friends would laugh at his clever entertainment. The moment came when Isabella entered the dining room to quietly collect some empty glasses. She moved carefully around the table, trying not to interrupt the conversation. David saw his opportunity and decided to strike. "Excuse me," David said loudly, his voice cutting through the dinner conversation. All eyes turned to him, then to Isabella, who froze with a tray of glasses in her hands. "I need to address something with our cleaning lady here." Isabella looked confused, but remained professional. "Is there something wrong, Mr. Davidson?" David stood up dramatically, enjoying the attention from his audience. "Actually, there is. I've been noticing some problems with your work lately. Just today, I found you had moved items in my office without permission. And yesterday, you left water spots on my bathroom mirror." Isabella blinked in surprise. She knew both accusations were completely false. She had been extra careful in his office, and she always dried mirrors perfectly to avoid water spots. But she remained calm, as she had learned to do with difficult clients. "I apologize if there was any issue, Mr. Davidson. Could you show me specifically what needs to be corrected?" David's friends were watching this exchange with growing discomfort. They had expected dinner conversation and good wine, not a public confrontation with household staff. Catherine shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while Robert stared at his plate, clearly embarrassed. But David was just getting started. He had planned this moment for weeks, and he wasn't going to let their discomfort stop him now. "And another thing," David continued, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "I don't appreciate the way you've been snooping around my personal belongings. I've seen you looking at my private papers and handling my expensive items carelessly." This accusation was so outrageous that Isabella actually gasped. She had been nothing but respectful of his privacy and extremely careful with his belongings. Several of David's guests exchanged worried glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was taking. "Mr. Davidson," Isabella said quietly, her voice steady despite the unfair attack, "I have never looked at your personal papers or handled your belongings carelessly. I take pride in my work and always treat my clients' homes with respect." David laughed mockingly, looking around at his friends as if expecting them to join in. But instead of laughter, he saw concerned faces and disapproving frowns. Michael actually shook his head slightly, clearly disgusted by David's behavior. "Oh, please," David continued, now feeling like he had to prove his point even more dramatically. "You people are all the same. You come into our homes, pretend to be professional, but really, you're just looking for opportunities to take advantage of us. I bet you can't even speak proper English most of the time." This last comment was particularly cruel and completely baseless. Isabella had been speaking perfect English throughout their entire interaction, and David knew it. But he was so caught up in his need to feel superior that he was saying anything he could think of to belittle her. Isabella felt her face flush with anger and hurt, but she took a deep breath before responding. Instead of defending herself or arguing back, she did something completely unexpected. She pulled out her phone and began speaking in rapid, fluent Spanish to someone on the other end. David smiled triumphantly, thinking he had proven his point about her not speaking English properly. He turned to his friends with a satisfied expression, expecting to see approval, or at least amusement at his clever trap, but his friends were staring at him with expressions of horror and disgust. Catherine actually pushed her chair back from the table, as if she didn't want to be associated with what was happening. Robert was shaking his head in disbelief, while Michael looked like he wanted to leave immediately. After finishing her phone call, Isabella calmly placed her phone back in her pocket and looked directly at David. When she spoke, Her voice was clear, confident, and filled with a dignity that made David's cruel behavior look even worse by comparison. "Mr. Davidson," she said, her English absolutely perfect, "I was just speaking with my research supervisor at Stanford University. You see, I'm not just a cleaning lady. I'm currently completing my PhD in sociology, and I've been working in domestic service as part of my research on income inequality and class dynamics in America." The silence in the dining room was deafening. David's mouth fell open as he tried to process what Isabella had just said. His friends stared at her with newfound respect and growing horror at David's behavior. Isabella continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "For the past 3 years, I've been documenting how wealthy employers treat their domestic staff. I've worked for dozens of families, and I've seen the full spectrum of human behavior, from genuine kindness to—" She paused, looking directly at David, complete lack of basic human decency. Catherine was the first to speak, her voice filled with embarrassment for David's behavior. "Dr. ... She paused, realizing she didn't know Isabella's title. "Rodriguez," Isabella supplied. "Isabella Rodriguez. And it's not doctor yet, but thank you." Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Isabella, I want to apologize for what just happened here. David's behavior is completely unacceptable." But Isabella wasn't finished. She had endured weeks of David's increasingly unreasonable demands, his obvious attempts to trap her in mistakes, and now his public humiliation attempt. All for research that was going to help people understand exactly this kind of treatment. "What's particularly interesting from a research perspective," Isabella continued, her voice taking on the tone of an academic presenting findings, "is how some individuals use their economic power to dehumanize service workers, treating them as objects for entertainment rather than as fellow human beings deserving of basic respect." David finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak stammer. "You ... You're a student?" "A PhD candidate conducting field research," Isabella corrected. "And Mr. Davidson, your behavior over the past several weeks has provided me with an excellent case study in how privilege can corrupt a person's moral compass." The silence that followed Isabella's revelation stretched on for what felt like forever. David sat frozen in his chair, his face pale and his mouth still hanging open. He looked like someone who had just been hit by a truck and was still trying to figure out what had happened. His carefully planned evening of entertainment had just exploded in his face in the most spectacular way possible. Michael was the first to recover from the shock. He leaned forward in his chair, genuinely interested in what Isabella had to say. "Stanford University? That's incredibly impressive. What's your research focus exactly?" Isabella straightened her shoulders, her confidence growing as she realized she had the room's complete attention. "I'm studying how economic inequality affects social interactions, particularly the relationship between employers and domestic workers. My thesis examines how wealth can either bring out the best in people through increased empathy and generosity, or the worst through a sense of superiority and entitlement." Catherine nodded thoughtfully, clearly fascinated. "And you've been working as a housekeeper to gather this data firsthand? That's brilliant research methodology." "Exactly," Isabella replied. "I wanted to experience these dynamics from the worker's perspective, not just read about them in academic papers or conduct interviews. After the fact, there's something about being invisible in wealthy homes that reveals people's true character." Robert looked ashamed as he glanced around the expensive dining room. "I have to ask, and please be honest, how do most of your employers treat you?" Isabella considered the question carefully. "Most people are actually quite decent. They might be a bit distant or formal, but they're respectful. They pay on time, don't make unreasonable demands, and treat me like a professional providing a service. Some are genuinely kind and appreciative." She paused, her eyes briefly meeting David's before continuing. But there's a small percentage who seem to view household staff as entertainment or as targets for their frustrations. They create impossible tasks, make demeaning comments, or try to catch workers in mistakes that don't exist. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. David belonged firmly in that second category, and his friends were beginning to see him in a completely different light. Another guest, Patricia, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. This research sounds incredibly important. Have you found any patterns in the behavior you've observed? Isabella's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone passionate about her work. Oh yes, several fascinating patterns. For instance, people who inherited their wealth tend to be more demanding than those who earned it themselves. New money often comes with more empathy because they remember what it was like to work for someone else. She continued, warming to her subject. I've also noticed that people going through personal difficulties often take out their frustrations on their staff. It's like they need to feel powerful in one area of their life when they feel powerless in others. This observation hit David like a physical blow. He thought about his recent breakup, his growing isolation from genuine friendships, and his increasing dissatisfaction with his success. Isabella had just described his exact situation with uncomfortable accuracy. Michael pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. Isabella, I have to ask, are you planning to publish this research? Yes, I'm hoping to turn my dissertation into a book that general readers can understand, not just academics. I think people need to understand how these invisible relationships shape our society. Michael looked up from his phone with excitement. I just sent a text to my friend Jennifer at Manhattan Publishing. She's always looking for compelling social research that can reach mainstream audiences. Would you be interested in meeting with her? Isabella blinked in surprise. You would do that? Even after what just happened here tonight. Especially after what happened here tonight, Michael replied firmly. Your research is obviously needed if intelligent people like David can behave so badly without even realizing it. Patricia leaned forward eagerly. Isabella, I run a foundation that funds social justice research. This is exactly the kind of work we support. How can we help make sure your research reaches the people who need to hear it? Catherine, who had been listening intently, suddenly laughed, but not in a mean way. Do you realize what's happening here, David? You invited us here, planning to embarrass Isabella, but instead, she's about to become the most successful person at this table. David finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me who you were? Why did you let me treat you that way? Isabella looked at him with something that might have been pity. Because the moment people know I'm a PhD student, they start treating me differently. They become self-conscious, can start performing instead of acting naturally. I needed to see who you really are when you think no one important is watching. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. David realized that every cruel comment, every impossible demand, every attempt to embarrass or belittle her had been carefully documented and would soon be shared with the world. Robert shook his head in disgust. David, I've known you for 10 years, and I've never seen this side of you. What happened to you, man? But David couldn't answer because he didn't really know himself. When had he become the kind of person who enjoyed making others feel small? When had his success turned him into someone who treated other people like objects for his amusement? Meanwhile, Isabella's phone was buzzing constantly with new messages. Word was spreading quickly through academic and publishing circles about the Stanford PhD student who had just delivered the most dramatic research presentation anyone had ever witnessed. Patricia was already making plans. Isabella, I want to fund a speaking tour for you. Universities, conferences, corporate training programs. People need to hear about this research. Michael was still working his connections. I'm setting up meetings with 3 different publishers. And I know a documentary filmmaker who would be fascinated by your story. Catherine was thinking bigger picture. Have you considered the policy implications of your research? This could influence how domestic worker protections are written. As the conversation continued around him, David felt increasingly isolated. His friends were no longer talking to him or even acknowledging his presence. They were completely focused on Isabella and her work. The woman he had planned to humiliate was now the center of attention, while he sat forgotten in his own dining room. But the worst part wasn't being ignored. The worst part was the growing realization of what he had become. Looking at Isabella now, seeing her intelligence, dignity, and passion for helping others, David couldn't understand how he had ever thought it would be entertaining to hurt her. Isabella checked her watch and realized she had been at the dinner party for over 2 hours. I should probably go, she said, standing up from where she had been leaning against the kitchen doorway. I have a lot of work to do tonight. Wait, Catherine called out. Before you leave, I have to ask, what's the title of your book going to be? Isabella smiled for the first time all evening, and it transformed her entire face. Invisible People. What your housekeeper knows about you. The room erupted in appreciative laughter and applause. Everyone except David, who sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his attempt to embarrass Isabella had instead launched her career and destroyed his own reputation among his closest friends. As Isabella gathered her things to leave, she paused at the dining room entrance and looked back at David one final time. Mr. Davidson, thank you. Your behavior has given me the perfect ending for my book. And with that, she walked out of his apartment and into a future that was suddenly brighter than she had ever imagined possible. 3 weeks after the disastrous dinner party, David sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the same view he had admired for years. But now it felt different. The expensive furniture, the artwork, the luxury that had once made him feel successful, now just reminded him of how empty his life had become. His friends had been politely avoiding him since that night, and he couldn't blame them. The worst part was the silence. Isabella hadn't returned to clean his apartment since that Friday evening. The cleaning service had sent someone else, a middle-aged man named Carlos, who did excellent work, but made David feel uncomfortable in a completely different way. Carlos treated him with professional courtesy, but David could see the judgment in his eyes. Word had clearly spread about what happened that night. David had tried to go back to his normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. He couldn't use his home office without remembering how he had deliberately scattered papers to try to catch Isabella snooping. He couldn't walk into his kitchen without thinking about how she had worked quietly while he planned her humiliation. Every room in his apartment held reminders of his cruel behavior. Meanwhile, Isabella's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The day after the dinner party, her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Publishers wanted to meet with her, journalists wanted interviews, and academics were inviting her to speak at conferences. Michael's friend from Manhattan Publishing had offered her a book deal that would pay more than she had ever dreamed of earning. But success hadn't made Isabella forget about David. In quiet moments between meetings and interviews, she found herself thinking about the broken man she had left sitting at his dining room table. She had seen enough during her research to recognize the signs of someone who was deeply unhappy, even if they expressed it in hurtful ways. 1 month after the dinner party, David did something he hadn't done in years. He volunteered. A friend had mentioned a community center that served meals to homeless families, and David decided to spend his Saturday helping out. He told himself it was just to get out of his apartment, but deep down, he knew it was because Isabella's words about empathy and human decency had stayed with him. The work was harder than David expected. He spent hours chopping vegetables, serving food, and cleaning tables. His expensive clothes got dirty, his hands got sore, and by the end of the day, he was exhausted. But something strange happened during those hours of physical work. For the first time in months, David felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with money or success. The people he served were grateful for the meal, but they didn't know or care about his wealth. They saw him as just another volunteer willing to help. One elderly woman thanked him for the extra portion of soup he gave her, and her simple gratitude meant more to him than any business deal he had ever closed. David started volunteering every weekend. He worked at the community center, helped at a local food bank, and even spent time reading to children at a homeless shelter. The work was anonymous and unpaid, but it gave him something he hadn't felt in years: genuine satisfaction from helping others. 2 months after the dinner party, David saw Isabella's face on the cover of a magazine in the grocery store. The headline read, "The PhD Who Cleaned Houses to Expose Inequality." He bought the magazine and read the entire interview, learning more about Isabella's background and research than he had ever known while she worked for him. The article mentioned that Isabella had grown up in a working-class family where her mother cleaned houses to pay for Isabella's education. It talked about how Isabella had worked multiple jobs throughout college and graduate school, never taking her opportunities for granted. Reading about her struggles and determination made David realize how little he had understood about the person who had cleaned his home for weeks. The interview also mentioned David, though not by name. Isabella had described him as a case study in how isolation and privilege can corrupt someone's ability to see others as human beings. But she had also said something that surprised him. "I believe most people are capable of change if they're willing to do the hard work of examining their own behavior." That quote stayed with David for days. Isabella seemed to believe that even someone like him could become better, and that gave him hope. 3 months after the dinner party, David did something that required more courage than any business decision he had ever made. He reached out to Isabella through her university email and asked if they could meet. He expected her to refuse, and he would have understood if she had. But after a week of waiting, she agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near campus. Isabella looked different when David saw her again. She was dressed professionally, her confidence was obvious, and she carried herself like someone who belonged in academic circles. But when she looked at him, David saw something he didn't expect: curiosity rather than anger. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," David said, genuinely nervous for one of the first times in his adult life. "I know I don't deserve your time after how I treated you." Isabella studied his face carefully. "You look different," she said finally. "Tired, but not in a bad way. More like someone who's been working hard." David was surprised she could see the change. "I've been volunteering at community centers, food banks. It started because of what you said that night about empathy and human decency. I realized I didn't have much of either." "What made you decide to reach out to me?" Isabella asked. David took a deep breath. "I read your magazine interview. You said people could change if they were willing to do the work. I wanted you to know that I'm trying to do that work, and I wanted to apologize properly for how I treated you." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "David, can I ask you something? Why did you plan that dinner party? What were you hoping to accomplish by embarrassing me?" The question David had been dreading finally came. He could have made excuses or tried to minimize his behavior, but Isabella's research had taught him that honesty was the only path forward. "I was angry and bitter after my girlfriend left me," David admitted. "She said I was heartless, and instead of looking at why she might be right, I decided to prove I had power over someone else. I thought humiliating you would make me feel better about myself." "And did it?" Isabella asked. David shook his head. "It made me feel worse than I've ever felt in my life. Watching you handle my cruelty with such dignity while I acted like a spoiled child showed me exactly what kind of person I had become." Isabella leaned back in her chair, considering his words. You know, David, your behavior that night actually helped my research in an unexpected way. It showed me that even intelligent, successful people can lose their way when they stop seeing others as fully human. She paused, then continued. But it also taught me something else. People can recognize their mistakes and choose to change. The fact that you're sitting here, volunteering your time to help others, proves that transformation is possible. David felt tears building in his eyes. Does that mean you can forgive me? Isabella smiled, and David remembered how that smile had transformed her face the night she left his apartment. Forgiveness isn't really the right word, David. What you did was wrong, and it hurt me. But I can see that you're genuinely trying to become a better person, and that matters. 6 months later, David stood in the back of a packed auditorium, listening to Isabella deliver a lecture about her research to a crowd of academics, social workers, and policymakers. Her book had become a bestseller, and she was now considered one of the leading experts on economic inequality in America. As Isabella concluded her presentation, she mentioned that change was possible for everyone, including those who had lost their way. Some of the most powerful moments in my research came from watching people recognize their own capacity for both cruelty and kindness, she said. The choice between those two paths is one we all make every day. After the lecture, David didn't try to speak with Isabella. Instead, he quietly left the auditorium and returned to his volunteer work at the community center. He had learned that true satisfaction came not from being recognized or praised, but from using his privileges to help others rather than hurt them. Isabella's research had changed both their lives, but in very different ways. She had found her voice and her platform to help others understand the hidden dynamics of inequality. David had found his humanity again, one small act of service at a time. And sometimes, that kind of quiet transformation is the most powerful change of all.